Sarah looked like any other passenger in seat 14C until the hijackers took control. When the air marshal whispered her old military call sign Hawk, the quiet woman reading a paperback book disappeared. In her place sat the legendary fighter pilot who would either save 200 lives or die trying. Before watching full story, comment below from where are you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. Sarah Mitchell walked through Denver International Airport like any other tired traveler on a Tuesday morning. She wore faded jeans, comfortable sneakers, and a gray cardigan that had seen better days. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she carried only a small backpack and a paperback novel she had picked up at the airport bookstore. Nothing about her appearance suggested that she had once been one of the most decorated fighter pilots in military history. At the gate for United Flight 847 to Washington, D.C., Sarah found a quiet corner seat and opened her book. Around her, other passengers talked on phones, worked on laptops, or complained about flight delays. A businessman argued loudly with someone about a missed meeting. A young mother tried to calm her crying baby. College students laughed as they planned their spring break trip. Sarah observed it all with the trained eye of someone who had spent years assessing threats and situations. But to everyone else, she looked like just another passenger waiting to board. The gate agent called for boarding and passengers lined up in their designated groups. Sarah was in group 4, middle of the pack, exactly where she preferred to be. Not first class where people might notice her, not last where she might draw attention. She had perfected the art of being invisible during her 3 years of civilian life. On the plane, Sarah made her way to seat 14C, the middle seat she had deliberately chosen. Window seats made her feel trapped, and aisle seats meant more interaction with flight attendants and other passengers. The middle seat was perfect for someone who wanted to disappear completely. To her left in 14A sat Frank Morrison, a heavy-set man in his 50s wearing a wrinkled business suit. He was already talking to the flight attendant about upgrading to first class, explaining loudly that he was a frequent flyer and valued customer. When he settled into his seat, he immediately turned to Sarah with the practiced smile of a natural salesman. "First time flying to DC?" Frank asked, extending his hand. Frank Morrison, Morrison Insurance Solutions. Been making this route twice a month for 15 years. Sarah shook his hand briefly. Sarah Mitchell. Just visiting family. Family's important, Frank nodded, then launched into a detailed explanation of his insurance business, his wife's upcoming retirement party, and his son's recent promotion at a law firm. Sarah made appropriate listening sounds while mentally cataloging everything around her. Exit rows at 12 and 25. Flight attendants looked experienced and professional. Emergency equipment locations. Standard 737 to 800 configuration. All normal. In seat 14B, a young woman named Jenny Walsh struggled to fit her oversized laptop bag under the seat in front of her. She wore designer jeans and an expensive blouse, but her stressed expression and constant phone checking suggested she was not as confident as she wanted to appear. "Sorry," Jenny said to Sarah as her elbow bumped her arm. "Big presentation today. 3 years building this company, and if today doesn't go well." She didn't finish the sentence, just shook her head and opened her laptop. "What kind of company?" Sarah asked politely. "Supply chain management software for small businesses," Jenny replied, typing frantically. "I know it sounds boring, but there's a huge market for it. At least I hope there is. These investors today will either fund our next round or I'll be looking for a job next week." Sarah nodded sympathetically. She remembered the stress of high-stakes missions, though her life-or-death situations had been quite different. "I'm sure you'll do great." "Thanks," Jenny smiled for the first time. "I keep telling myself that the worst thing that can happen is they say no. It's not like anyone's going to die if my PowerPoint presentation isn't perfect." If only she knew, Sarah thought, that the woman sitting next to her had once given briefings where the wrong decision could cost dozens of lives. But those days were over. Now Sarah worked part-time at a small nonprofit in Colorado, helped elderly neighbors with their groceries, and lived a quiet life that no one from her past would recognize. 3 rows behind Sarah, Air Marshal David Torres pretended to read a Sports Illustrated magazine while scanning the passengers. At 38, Torres had 20 years of law enforcement experience, including 8 years as an air marshal. He had learned to blend in completely, to become invisible while staying alert for any signs of trouble. Torres had chosen seat 17F specifically because it gave him a clear view of most of the cabin and quick access to both the cockpit and the main passenger areas. He wore jeans, a polo shirt, and sneakers, the uniform of unremarkable middle-aged travelers. His weapon was concealed in a shoulder holster under his light jacket, and his badge and credentials were in his front pocket for quick access. As passengers settled in, Torres did his standard threat assessment. The college kids were loud but harmless. The business travelers were focused on their phones and laptops. The families with children were dealing with normal travel stress. Nothing unusual, nothing that raised red flags. His eyes briefly passed over the woman in 14C. Brown hair, average build, reading a paperback novel. She had moved through the boarding process efficiently, helped other passengers with their carry-on bags, and now sat quietly reading. Completely normal. Torres's attention moved on to other passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard United Flight 847 with non-stop service to Washington Dulles International Airport, the flight attendant announced over the intercom. Our flight time today will be approximately 2 hours and 45 minutes. Please ensure your seat backs are upright and tray tables are stowed for takeoff. Frank continued talking to Sarah about his insurance business, explaining the difference between term life and whole life policies in great detail. Sarah listened politely while watching the safety demonstration. She had memorized aircraft safety procedures years ago, but she still paid attention. Old habits from her military days, when missing a detail could mean the difference between life and death. Jenny typed frantically on her laptop, occasionally muttering things like, "No, that slide doesn't work," and "Why won't this chart update?" Her nervous energy was contagious, and other nearby passengers kept glancing at her with sympathetic looks. The plane pushed back from the gate and taxied toward the runway. Sarah looked out the small window and watched the ground crew working around other aircraft. The organized chaos of a major airport always reminded her of aircraft carrier operations, though civilian aviation moved at a much slower pace than military operations. During takeoff, Sarah noticed the subtle vibrations and sounds that indicated everything was functioning normally. The engine spooled up evenly, the aircraft accelerated smoothly down the runway, and they lifted off without any issues. Sarah had thousands of hours of flight time in military aircraft, and she could detect problems that other passengers would never notice. This takeoff was perfect. Once they reached cruising altitude, the flight attendants began beverage service. Frank ordered a whiskey and ginger ale, explaining that he always drank the same thing on flights because it helped him relax. Jenny asked for coffee, then immediately returned to her laptop. Sarah requested water and went back to her book, though she continued to monitor the cabin activity around her. For the first hour of the flight, everything proceeded normally. Passengers read, worked on computers, watched movies on their tablets, or dozed. The flight attendants moved through the cabin efficiently, offering snacks and drinks. The pilots made a brief announcement about smooth weather and their expected on-time arrival in Washington. Sarah found herself relaxing slightly, something that had taken months of practice after leaving the military. 4 years, she had lived in a state of constant alertness, always ready for the next mission, the next crisis, the next life-threatening situation. Civilian life had taken serious adjustment, but she was finally learning to let her guard down during routine activities like flying commercial airlines. That comfortable routine was shattered at exactly 1:47 p.m. Mountain Time, about 90 minutes into the flight. The first sign of trouble was a sharp metallic bang that echoed through the cabin, followed immediately by a violent shuddering that threw passengers against their seat belts. This wasn't turbulence. Sarah's years of flight experience told her immediately that something mechanical had failed, and it was serious. What the hell was that? Frank asked, gripping his armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white. Before Sarah could answer, the plane lurched sharply to the left, then overcorrected to the right. Passengers cried out in alarm. Laptops and drinks flew across the cabin. Jenny's coffee spilled all over her computer, and she stared at the brown liquid dripping onto her presentation materials. The captain's voice came over the intercom, but instead of the calm, professional tone passengers expected, there was an edge of tension that made everyone pay attention. "Ah, folks, this is Captain Williams. We're experiencing some technical difficulties up here. Flight attendants, please return to your seats immediately and prepare for possible emergency procedures." The aircraft shuddered again, more violently this time. Sarah could feel the plane losing altitude faster than it should. Emergency lighting flickered on, and oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling compartments above every seat. The flight attendants moved quickly through the cabin, their professional training evident as they helped passengers with their oxygen masks while fighting to stay upright in the unstable aircraft. But Sarah could see the fear in their eyes. Whatever was happening was serious enough to scare experienced crew members. "Please place the mask over your nose and mouth and breathe normally," the senior flight attendant announced, though her voice was tight with barely controlled panic. Assist children and those who need help before securing your own mask. Frank fumbled with his oxygen mask, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't get the elastic strap over his head. Sarah quickly helped him while simultaneously securing her own mask and checking on Jenny, who was hyperventilating and making her situation worse. "Jenny, look at me," Sarah said calmly, her voice slightly muffled by the oxygen mask. "You need to slow your breathing. In through your nose, hold for 3 seconds, out through your mouth. You're going to be fine, but I need you to breathe slowly." Something in Sarah's voice, the absolute calm, the quiet authority, made Jenny focus on her instead of panicking. Jenny nodded and began following Sarah's breathing instructions. Around the cabin, other passengers were not handling the emergency as well. Children were crying, adults were praying or calling loved ones on their cell phones, and several people were openly weeping. The aircraft continued to shake and lurch unpredictably. Sarah's military training automatically kicked in. While other passengers panicked, she began analyzing the situation with the cold efficiency that had made her legendary in combat. The symptoms didn't match any mechanical failure she knew. The aircraft was descending too rapidly for a controlled emergency landing, but the descent wasn't steep enough to suggest complete control loss. Something else was happening. That's when Air Marshal Torres made his move. Torres had been trained to recognize real emergencies versus normal turbulence or minor mechanical issues. This was definitely real, but something about the situation bothered him. The captain should have been making regular announcements, declaring an emergency with air traffic control, and requesting vectors to the nearest airport. Instead, there had been only one brief, tense communication. Torres unbuckled his seatbelt and began moving forward through the cabin, using the seatbacks for support as the aircraft continued its erratic motion. As he passed row 14, something made him pause and look more carefully at the woman in the middle seat. While everyone around her panicked, she remained completely calm. Not the frozen calm of shock, but the controlled calm of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. Her posture, the way she helped other passengers, the way she continuously scanned the cabin, it all reminded Torres of something familiar. Then he remembered a classified briefing 3 years ago about military assets transitioning to civilian life. There had been photographs and files on several retired personnel who might be valuable resources in certain situations. One file had stood out, a female fighter pilot with the call sign Hawk. The photo had shown a woman in military uniform, but the bone structure, the eyes, the way she carried herself, it all matched the passenger in 14C. Torres leaned down close to Sarah's ear and whispered, "Hawk?" The effect was immediate and dramatic. Sarah's entire body went rigid. Only someone from the military or intelligence community would know that call sign. She turned to look directly at Torres, her eyes sharp and analyzing. In that moment, her civilian disguise fell away completely. "That was a long time ago," she whispered back. Torres discreetly showed her his Air Marshal badge. "David Torres, Federal Air Marshal Service. I need to get to the cockpit. Something's wrong beyond mechanical failure." Sarah's training allowed her to instantly understand what Torres wasn't saying directly. No radio contact? Nothing for the last 12 minutes. Captain should be declaring an emergency, requesting emergency landing clearance, updating passengers every few minutes. Instead, we got one announcement and then silence. Sarah processed this information with the speed that had made her famous in military circles. No communication with ground control during a serious emergency violated every protocol. Either the pilots were incapacitated or someone was preventing them from making radio calls. "You think we've been hijacked?" Sarah asked quietly. "I think someone has control of the cockpit who shouldn't," Torres replied. "And I can't handle it alone. I need someone with combat training and aviation knowledge." Sarah looked around the cabin at the terrified passengers. Frank was still gripping his armrests and praying. Jenny had managed to control her breathing but was staring at her ruined laptop with tears in her eyes. Children were crying in their parents' arms. Elderly passengers looked confused and frightened. 3 years ago, Sarah had retired from the military specifically to avoid situations like this. She had completed her service, served her country with distinction, and earned the right to a quiet civilian life. She had deliberately chosen to fly commercial airlines as a regular passenger, to blend in completely with ordinary people living ordinary lives. But these ordinary people were about to die if someone didn't act. "What do you need?" Sarah asked Torres, and in that moment the transformation was complete. The quiet passenger from seat 14C was gone. Hawk was back. Torres quickly explained the situation. He believed that hijackers had somehow gained control of the cockpit, either through violence or by infiltrating the flight crew. The erratic flight pattern and lack of communication supported this theory. Torres needed to get to the cockpit to assess the situation, but approaching from the main cabin would be obvious and dangerous. "I need someone to approach from the service areas," Torres said. "Someone who knows aircraft layout and can move without being detected." Sarah nodded. Her pilot training included detailed knowledge of aircraft systems and layouts. Her combat experience included infiltration and close-quarters combat. And her years flying dangerous missions had taught her to stay calm under pressure. "Give me 3 minutes to get into position," Sarah said. "Then approach from the front. When you make contact, I'll come from behind." Sarah told Frank and Jenny that she was going to the bathroom, then slipped away from her seat. Instead of heading to the passenger restroom, she moved toward the rear galley where the flight attendants stored supplies and prepared meals. She found Flight Attendant Melissa crouched behind a food cart, speaking quietly into a phone. "Don't know what's happening up there," Melissa was saying. "3 men went into the cockpit about 20 minutes ago. They had weapons. They told us if anyone tried to interfere, they would kill the pilots and crash the plane." Sarah approached carefully. "Melissa? I'm here to help." Melissa looked up, startled. "Ma'am, you need to return to your seat immediately." "I'm working with the Air Marshal," Sarah said quietly, showing her military ID that she still carried. "I need you to tell me exactly what happened." Seeing the military identification, Melissa's expression changed. She quickly explained that 3 passengers had somehow obtained weapons and forced their way into the cockpit. They had threatened to kill Captain Williams and First Officer Rodriguez if the crew interfered. Since then, the men had been controlling the aircraft while making no contact with ground control. "Where are they now?" Sarah asked. 2 are in the cockpit with the pilots. The 3rd is standing guard just outside the cockpit door. Sarah nodded and began formulating a plan. Standard hijacking protocols assumed that the terrorists would negotiate, make demands, or try to land the aircraft at a specific location. But these hijackers seemed different. They were maintaining radio silence and flying erratically, which suggested they might be planning to crash the aircraft deliberately. Using the service corridors that connected the galleys, Sarah made her way toward the front of the aircraft. Her movement was silent and professional, using techniques she had learned in military survival training. Other passengers had no idea she was moving through the aircraft. At the forward galley, Sarah positioned herself where she could see the cockpit area. Just as Melissa had described, 1 man stood guard outside the cockpit door. He was young, maybe mid-20s, wearing jeans and a baseball cap. He held what appeared to be a knife, and his eyes constantly scanned the main cabin for threats. Sarah used hand signals to communicate with Torres, who was approaching from the passenger area. They had worked together for less than 10 minutes, but both were trained professionals who understood tactical coordination. The plan was simple but dangerous. Torres would approach the guard directly, drawing his attention and forcing him to focus on the threat from the front. At the same moment, Sarah would emerge from the service area behind the guard, neutralizing him before he could harm the pilots or alert his companions in the cockpit. Torres made his move first, walking casually toward the front of the aircraft as if heading to the restroom. When the guard noticed him and raised his weapon threateningly, Sarah struck. Her combat training took over completely. She emerged from the galley silently, disabled the guard's weapon arm with a precise strike, and rendered him unconscious before he could make a sound. The entire encounter lasted less than 5 seconds. Torres caught the unconscious guard and dragged him into the galley while Sarah approached the cockpit door. Through the small window she could see 2 more hijackers inside with the pilots. Captain Williams appeared to be injured, with blood on his forehead. First Officer Rodriguez was conscious but appeared to be under severe threat. The aircraft lurched again, more violently than before. They were still descending rapidly, and Sarah realized they were approaching the mountainous terrain west of Denver. If the hijackers were planning to crash the aircraft, they were running out of time. Sarah and Torres exchanged quick hand signals. They would enter the cockpit simultaneously, Torres through the main door, Sarah through the emergency access panel that most passengers didn't know existed. It was a desperate plan, but they had no choice. The assault on the cockpit happened with military precision. Torres burst through the main door while Sarah came through the emergency panel, catching both hijackers completely off guard. The confined space of the cockpit made the fight brief and brutal, but within 30 seconds, both terrorists were unconscious and restrained. Captain Williams was bleeding from a head wound but was conscious. "Thank God," he gasped. "They were going to crash us into the mountains." But their problems were far from over. First Officer Rodriguez was unconscious, and Captain Williams was too injured to safely control the aircraft. They were still descending rapidly toward dangerous terrain, and someone needed to fly the plane immediately. Sarah looked at the complex instrument panel of the 737-800. She had never flown this exact aircraft type, but her thousands of hours of military flight time had taught her that the basic principles were the same. More importantly, she was the only person on the aircraft capable of attempting what needed to be done. "I can fly this," she told Torres. "Are you sure?" Sarah slipped into the pilot's seat and her hands moved across the controls with practiced efficiency. All those years of training, all those dangerous missions, all the skills that had earned her the call sign Hawk, they all came flooding back as if she had never stopped flying. She immediately began climbing to gain altitude and avoid the mountains. Her fingers found the radio controls and she broadcast on the emergency frequency, "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is United 847 declaring emergency. Hawk is flying." The response from air traffic control was immediate. "United 847, this is Denver Center. Did you say Hawk is flying? Please confirm." "Confirmed, Denver. Hawk has the aircraft. Requesting immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport and emergency equipment standing by." There was a brief pause, then, "United 847, understand Hawk has control. We're clearing all traffic. Turn right heading 090, descend and maintain 12,000 feet. Denver International is 60 miles northeast. Emergency equipment is being positioned." Air traffic controllers who had been in the military recognized the call sign Hawk. Within minutes, word had spread through the facility that the legendary pilot was flying a hijacked commercial airliner. Every controller and supervisor on duty focused entirely on getting Flight 847 safely on the ground. Sarah flew the 737 with the same precision that had made her famous in military circles. She compensated for the aircraft's damage, managed the complex approach to Denver International, and kept the passengers informed with calm, professional announcements. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your pilot speaking," Sarah said over the intercom, though she didn't identify herself by name. "We've resolved the emergency situation and are returning to Denver for a precautionary landing. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened. We'll be on the ground in 15 minutes. The landing was perfect. Sarah greeted the runway with the gentlest touch, deployed the brakes smoothly, and brought the aircraft to a complete stop exactly where ground control had requested. Emergency vehicles surrounded the plane immediately, but there was no fire, no further injuries and no additional drama. Paramedics boarded the aircraft to treat Captain Williams and check on the other passengers. FBI agents arrested the 3 hijackers and began processing the crime scene. Airport security helped passengers disembark and provided counseling services for those who needed it. Through it all, Sarah tried to remain as anonymous as possible. She answered questions from FBI agents and provided a detailed report of what had happened, but she avoided media attention and declined requests for interviews. Frank Morrison found her in the terminal as passengers were being processed. "Sarah, I don't know what you did up there, but thank you. That was the most scared I've ever been in my life." Jenny Walsh also approached, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder and her presentation materials still stained with coffee. "I know you did something to help save us," she said. "I don't know what your background is, but you weren't just a regular passenger, were you?" Sarah smiled and gave both of them brief hugs. "Take care of yourselves," she said, then disappeared into the crowd of passengers, emergency workers and investigators. By the time FBI agents were ready for follow-up interviews, Sarah Mitchell had already caught another flight back to Colorado. She had given them her contact information and answered all necessary questions, but she had no interest in publicity or recognition. The media reported that hijackers had attempted to crash United Flight 847, but that an off-duty pilot had assisted in landing the aircraft safely. The FBI classified most details of the incident. Passengers eventually learned some of what had happened, but they never knew the full story of how they had been saved. Air Marshal David Torres wrote in his official report about the critical assistance he had received from a passenger with relevant military and aviation experience. He recommended Sarah for commendation, but she declined any formal recognition. 3 days later, Sarah Mitchell was back at her job with the nonprofit in Colorado, helping coordinate food deliveries to elderly residents. Her coworkers asked about her trip to Denver, and she told them it had been uneventful. She returned to her quiet civilian routine as if nothing had happened. But Sarah now understood something important about herself. She had spent 3 years trying to completely leave her military life behind, but some things were too fundamental to change. The skills that had made her Hawk were still there when people needed them. The courage, the training, the ability to act decisively in life-threatening situations. These weren't just job skills that she could retire from. They were part of who she was. A week later, Sarah was at Denver International Airport again, catching another flight for a different family visit. This time she chose seat 12A, a window seat where she could see the runway and watch the organized activity of aircraft operations. As she settled in with another paperback novel, a young flight attendant stopped by her row. "Excuse me, ma'am. Are you Sarah Mitchell?" Sarah looked up cautiously. "Yes. I'm Jennifer. I was working Flight 847 last week. I just wanted to say thank you. I don't know exactly what you did, but I know you helped save all of us." Sarah smiled. Just doing what needed to be done. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Sarah reflected on the events of the previous week. She had saved 200 lives by using skills she had hoped never to need again. She had worked with a professional she had never met before to stop terrorists and safely land a damaged aircraft. Most importantly, she had remembered who she really was. The quiet passenger in seat 14C had been a disguise, a way of hiding from her past. But Sarah Mitchell was still Hawk, and she always would be. The call sign represented years of dangerous missions, proven courage under fire, and an absolute commitment to protecting innocent lives. As Flight 672 climbed toward cruising altitude, Sarah opened her book and began reading. Around her, passengers talked, worked on laptops, and settled in for routine flights. Everything appeared completely normal. But if another emergency arose, if passengers found themselves in mortal danger with no clear way to survive, there was a legendary pilot sitting quietly in seat 12A. She looked like any other traveler, but she carried with her all the skills and courage that had once made her the most respected fighter pilot in the military. Hawk was always ready to answer the call.